Hello and welcome to Thinking Competition, the podcast by SEAS Associados, focusing on competition, business trends and economic regulation. This is a free zone for critical thinking on the markets of today and tomorrow. We want to challenge commonplace ideas and try to connect the dots in a rapidly changing world. We want to keep on asking why. Join us on this journey.
Hello and welcome back to the second part of our conversation on merger control with Professor Kai-Uwe Kühn. Today we're discussing substantive aspects of merger review and a few theories of harm that seem to be in fashion. Next topic, Kai-Uwe, I would like to move us on to substantive assessments and novel theories of harm. I know that all these topics seem to be pointing to kind of ideas of everything is novel. Perhaps not everything is that novel, but the general feeling, once again, that I have, at least as a practitioner, is that securing clearance for a merger has become substantially more difficult across the board. In addition to innovation and ecosystem concerns, once again largely specific to digital and pharma markets in the big cases that have been discussed, we've seen a growing concern with the elimination of potential competition, which seems to be a very valid concern in theory, but in fact, in practice, and as to its effects on the process of reviewing a merger, it can transform a vertical or a conglomerate merger into a horizontal one, which takes you from, a kind of a setting where you anticipate that no material concerns will be raised, typically to a setting where, you have overlap, but you have overlap with, potential competition rather than actual competition on the market today. Do you feel that these new theories of harm are robust in the sense that economic evidence actually shows that they can identify material competitive concerns that would otherwise come under the radar of a more traditional framework for merger review?
So I think this is an area in which kind of practice has gone significantly too far, despite the fact that I think there are not that many prohibitions that have come about through on the potential competition side. But I think, and what I always have in mind are several transactions in the UK in restaurant food delivery. So we had kind of the acquisition of Jet by takeaway.com, and we had the investment of Amazon in Deliveroo. Two things that essentially were taken by the UK regulator into phase two. And basically on the argument that these were highly concentrated markets because there were only three. And I think what that shows is that there is something missing in our way of how we're analyzing potential competition, especially in these cases. This becomes very obvious that we're never asking the question, well, what is an equilibrium market structure in this market? Is three a large number or a small number for this type of activity? Right? And it has two components to it. One is kind of not being very good at market definition and excluding things like, delivery from your local Chinese guy who does it by himself anyway. Takeaway orders. I might order and have it brought in, and the substitute is I do it myself and pick it up. And there are lots of possibilities of that nature, right? And that will have a constraining impact kind of on prices there as well. But I think even more important is the question of, is three large or is it small? And I think we're starting to learn that three in that sector is actually enormous. And it's very, very hard to make a profit. And when I saw these cases coming up, kind of the thought experiment I made was the following. So if you're Deliveroo and you have a biker, how many deliveries from restaurant point to consumer do you have to make in an hour to cover minimum wage? Well, if you're paying $2.50, Per delivery, that gets you to 5. That's actually really hard, but then you have to cover the overhead as well. So, and Deliveroo has been very, very creative, for example, in denser populated areas to create local kitchens where someone who has a really nice menu can do it kind of together with others so that you're reducing the number of pickup points in order to raise the efficiency exactly in that area. But it's kind of where they're squeezing out the efficiency in order to kind of get closer to profitability. That something like that gets taken all the way to phase 2, I think, is a failure of our framework in which we're evaluating potential competition. And I think kind of just the idea of having firms that have very high fixed costs that are creating a value that is somewhat of a luxury for most people, I think it takes a bit more understanding of what this market could actually ever look like, and not just the attitude of saying we want as fragmented a market as possible. So that's on the potential competition side. You wanted me to say a little bit also on the kind of new theories of harm?
Yes. You are extremely qualified to do so, and much more qualified than I am, obviously. I think that's. I also get a feel that's, I mean, from local enforcement in merger control procedures, that's this kind of looseness or vagueness around what theories of harm might make sense as applied to the specific facts of a transaction is resulting in kind of merger review procedures which are much longer than they should be, which kind of turn out to be a sort of arm twisting exercise whereby the competition authority kind of twists your arm into getting measures and remedies which are more nice to haves, and so nice things to present in a public in a PR setting, but not really essential to solve actual competitive problems arising from consummation of the transaction. And so if you could elaborate a little bit on other theories which are being applied, and how attached they are to solid economic evidence, or how much conversely they are an expression of this kind of existential angst with false negatives, and so not so robust, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think one of the kind of the two areas, or the two things I think are most important kind of in that context, I think, are hypothesized ecosystem effects and hypothesized network effects. And I think ecosystems effects, it's even kind of worse in a sense, because the way that ecosystem is used is extremely loose. And it's used in different ways, also in different contexts. Therefore, people can understand many things on it. I've seen a competition authority who's essentially said, this company has more than 3 products, therefore there's an ecosystem. Now, that cannot be the criterion. That's not kind of what we're concerned about. I mean, for me, the essential thing that there is with an ecosystem is that you have some kind of a base product that you're hanging on other things, and where there are limitations to substituting on these other things, because you would have to substitute your long-run base product, and if you're substituting the long-run base product that's very costly, that's why you're not substituting. So it's a lock-in effect, very similar to issues of aftermarkets. So you're basically saying, look, we cannot switch out in the aftermarket because it's so specific. Very often in aftermarkets, you can solve this through long-term contracts. Here in tech, we're talking about markets in which kind of the products that might link up to what you have very often aren't even there yet. So that the innovative nature of the market leads to the impossibility of solving the problem with long-term contracts. So there's a reasonable issue there. The question is, how does that even matter in mergers? Right? How are you creating ecosystem effects through the merger, or how do ecosystems effect make the merger different. And I haven't seen that. I mean, you certainly, I think even agency economists don't see the logic in booking e-Travelly of where the ecosystem kind of is supposed to be in that context. But I think the way of approaching that, because we're not going to get a general agreement that anything that's an ecosystem effect is essentially an aftermarket issue. And the question is, are you creating one or not? But it is an issue of lock-in. And for lock-in, you can test. And the test is multi-homing. So I think we need to get to a point where we say, if you're making an ecosystem argument, and I can show you that people massively multi-home, then that is not a problem. And I think one of the things that would have been perfectly possible in booking through survey or other instruments is to kind of find out, how do people actually shop? To what extent does shopping one product lock them in on the other or not? Do they systematically use different platforms for that type of search? And that would have been relevant evidence, right? And I think that is not the way that the case was built. So I'm not saying that you can never build cases on it. I'm just saying that, and I think that goes in the direction that you suggested, we're using this as the big club. And similar, we're using network effects as the big club, like in Germany, where you're saying, oh, it strengthens dominance. Well, the question really is the network effect transferable on the other firm that you're bringing in, and so on and so forth. So I think, yes, we kind of need to get away from the terms of basically saying, oh, the presence of this characteristic makes it worse, because that's very often not the case. And I think on the side of people working with the companies, we need to develop a set of typical evidence that can help reject those types of arguments. And that's really the type of work that we would try to do and are also doing in other contexts, like, for example, in the DMA, where I've worked, for example, on a rebuttal case. Again, kind of the question is, do you have an ecosystem effect here? Do you have lock-in? And you show multi-homing, right? So if we're getting to that point that we kind of can link evidence as rebuttal evidence to claims, then we're a big step further in order to kind of reining in these types of things. And it was very interesting. I was yesterday at a conference where people kind of felt that there's now a pushback against some of these things because the outcomes also seem to be random across different jurisdictions, right? And that's a sure sign that we don't have kind of a clear principled approach to those types of theories of harm.
Very quickly come to the final point I had on our script today, which is industrial policy and consolidation in the EU. Recently, the Draghi report, among other sources, has kind of renewed calls for greater pan-European consolidation, once again, assuming rather generically that scaling up is a necessary precondition for European industries to become more productive and to unlock investment. This also comes with a plea for facilitating sector-wide cooperation in several sectors and co-deployment schemes between competing firms. From an EU perspective, do you feel that more consolidation at a pan-European level, so cross-border consolidation, makes economic sense? Meaning, is this really a precondition to being more competitive on global markets and to enable greater investments? Or in some cases, could this just be a politically correct excuse to bail out companies or sectors where results have become stagnant or profit margins are actually falling?
Okay, so let's take this in different parts. So one is kind of the cross-border mergers for companies to get larger. That's actually something that was never restricted. I remember we had that discussion under Almunia as well, and Almunia said, look, if telecoms want to merge across countries, that's kind of fine. We don't have a problem with that in creating more unified market. The issue is the concentration within market. That is an issue. And so I think kind of this discussion about allowing more cross-border mergers is I think totally a red herring. It's not something that's been restricted or anything like this. We're really talking about the Siemens Alstom type of transactions of the world. And Siemens Alstom is kind of a poster child for that, because this is, as much as there's discussions even on economists' side on certain questions of merger enforcement like innovation, et cetera, I think there's been no greater consensus than, for example, on Siemens Alstom, that this didn't look like anything that should have gone through, and where I ex ante kind of thought, why would this go through? Essentially also because there was nothing that was a real efficiency that was being presented through that aggregation of firms. And I think, for me, it is also a disservice to a good industrial policy to focus this discussion on the question of the size of the firms and on mergers, because that's not the main lever for industrial policy where kind of things could be successful, right? There are others. It has to be issue dependent. Where are actually the problems? Yes, problems we do have in productivity, but we also know that productivity is enhanced overwhelmingly through the entry and exit process by good firms replacing bad firms and then growing strongly. That is something that is actually not happening enough in Europe. So we've had for decades a failure of underperforming firms to exit markets. And we had a failure of new entrants, which there are many, to actually grow to size. And that has nothing to do with merger policy. That's a question of how dynamic the markets is, how we're helping exit. There are some issues also on the financing side and on risk financing that we've had for a very long time. So these are all kinds of other issues. They're questions of basic commodities like electricity being very expensive, which keeps users of that out. So there's a question of, do we kind of need to direct investments into certain industries because those are the growth industries and we're not participating in the growth anymore? Again, this has nothing to do with mergers whatsoever. There is a mechanism to kind of bring efficiencies forward that has nothing to do with market definition as such. So for me, kind of the merger issue is a bit of a red herring. It's also heavily caveated in the Draghi report. I think that report is a little bit trying to kind of give something to all audiences to kind of participate in an effort. But I think that part is, we may get under more pressure to do these types of things, but on that question, I'm a bit torn because the question is, if you're solving the investment problem, if there is an underinvestment problem, are you still getting pricing issues that might come about, right? So is that actually the right policy, independently of the question, do behavioral remedies work as well as structural remedies? It's certainly the case that we know that structural remedies tend to be more effective than behavioral remedies. We have ex post analysis of that for a long period of time. And however you think whether merger policy has been too tough or not tough enough, I think that the very robust part of that work is to basically say that in most of the cases where we had bad outcomes after merger review were cases where we had an intervention, but the remedies weren't effective, right? And I think that concern has to remain. It's very clear that structural remedies will remain have to remain the main issue. Otherwise, we're not getting kind of at these points. But we'll see. I see circumstances where it might be attractive to have that. But I mean, for me, kind of the judgment is a little bit open there. Where we're going to go. I'd hate it if that tendency is purely a result of political pressures, because then we're in a very similar discussion as the national champions type of discussion.
Yeah, taking competition policy back, bashing it into something which is smaller than it should be.
Yeah, that's smaller than it should be, and I think it's not what competition policy should do, but it's really a matter of what instruments that does competition policy have to address certain issues. And if there are mechanisms in place where other issues come into merger policies that might overrule, like you have in Germany, for example, I think that's perfectly legitimate as long as the standards are clear and it's clear what instrument is being used for what objective that you want to achieve. If you're mixing that up, you're bound to, reduce the predictability of outcomes, but also getting bad results because you're using instruments that are not really designed for the type of outcomes that you're trying to achieve through it. So you're not doing any one of the policy objective a favor by using instruments that are not designed to do the things that are being used. And that's my biggest concern in kind of the political consideration coming into competition policy, because the competition policy instruments are basically not good instruments to achieve other policy objectives that you might have. They're just very powerful, and therefore there's a great desire to use those instead of going through that really difficult process of getting the legislation in place that will give you an institutional structure to implement these policies. And you'd rather go to institutions that already have powers, although their instruments might not be the right ones in order to achieve the policy goals, right? So I think that's our problem. But I don't think it helps competition policy by widening the remit, because that serves neither goal, I have to say.
Yeah. Although the temptation has been quite manifest.
The temptation has been quite manifest, yes. So, no, the temptation has been quite manifest. And the problem with all of these things is to create things because it's the easiest consensus, right? Of course, competition authorities are, this is just the incentives you're producing in an organization, right? If you're bigger, you're more important. If people think you're important, you've justified yourself.
Jurisdiction.
So it's very, very difficult to push back against getting more powers, right? I mean, who's going to do that? Just in terms of the incentives of the institution, and so of course that's going to be embraced. Whether it's good for the effectiveness of the institutions is a completely different question.
Thank you, Kai-Uwe. Thank you so much. It's been an incredibly interesting conversation. I've learned a lot from you. I'll be taking a lot of guidance from what we discussed today. I hope our listeners will enjoy this as much as I have. Thank you so much for your time. It's been wonderful to have you on.
Join us again soon for the next episode of Thinking Competition.